Jessica Hartley had never imagined she would find herself standing in front of a closed library door, listening in on a conversation that would change her life forever. The sound of muffled voices echoed in the hallway of the Duke of Ashford's townhouse. She was soaked to the bone, her once pristine gown now torn from the mad dash she had made in the freezing rain. Her heart raced in her chest, and despite the cold, she could feel the heat of panic rising in her veins. "I need a fiancé by Christmas Eve, or I lose everything." The voice of a man echoed from the other side of the door. Jessica's eyes widened. That voice! It was Sebastian Thornfield, the Duke of Ashford. She had heard rumors of him. He was known as a rake, a man who lived in scandal and luxury. The whispers in London were cruel and relentless. Yet, in that moment, those rumors seemed irrelevant. What mattered now was what she had just overheard. He needed a fiancé, and quickly. She couldn't breathe. Her mind raced. She didn't know what had brought her here, to this particular moment in this particular place, but she knew one thing. She couldn't afford to walk away from this opportunity. Before she could stop herself, her hand reached for the door handle, pushing it open with a creak that echoed in the otherwise silent hallway. There he stood, Sebastian Thornfield, with his back to her, facing the cold fireplace. His tall, broad figure cast a long shadow in the dimly lit room. He turned as he heard the door open, surprise flickering in his sharp eyes. Jessica didn't even pause to consider the implications of what she was about to say. "I'll do it," she blurted, her voice ringing out, barely louder than a whisper. "But I have one condition." Sebastian blinked, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Do what?" he asked, voice thick with confusion and curiosity. "I'll pretend to be your fiancé." "But only if you help me," she said, her voice firmer now, the desperation in her tone evident but controlled. The words left her lips before she could second-guess them. There was nothing else she could do. She had nothing left to lose. Sebastian's gaze softened, his expression shifting to something unreadable. The fire crackled behind him, but the air in the room suddenly felt thick and heavy. "Help you with what?" he asked cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Jessica took a breath, steadying herself. "Clear my family's debts," she said. £5,000, and I'll do it. I'll pretend to be your fiancé, whatever you need, but you help me save my family from ruin." Sebastian ran a hand through his dark hair, his jaw tightening. She could see the internal struggle behind his cool exterior, and for a brief moment, the two of them were connected in that shared silence. "£5,000 is no small sum, Miss Hartley," he finally said, his voice low. "You do realize the consequences, don't you?" "This arrangement, I'm desperate," she interrupted, her voice firm, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I have no other choice." Sebastian paused for a long moment, then slowly walked toward her, his every step deliberate and measured. He stopped just in front of her, his gaze never wavering from hers. "Fine," he said, his voice calm but tinged with something unreadable. "But there's one condition on my end as well." Jessica blinked. What condition? He let out a soft sigh, a wry smile playing at the corner of his lips. "No real feelings. This ends after New Year's Eve. A simple arrangement. Nothing more. No attachments." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room, and Jessica could feel a tension building in the air between them. But it was an agreement, a deal that could save her family, even if it was the most unusual deal she'd ever struck. She didn't hesitate, her hand outstretched to seal the bargain. "Agreed," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Sebastian's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, his lips tightening as though he were battling some unseen war within himself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. From it, he took a blood-red ink pen, dipped it, and handed it to her. "Let's make it official, then," he said, his voice softer now, his face impossible to read. Jessica took the pen with trembling fingers, the cold steel of it a stark contrast to the heat of the fire in the room. She signed her name quickly and decisively, as though this moment was her only chance for survival. She handed the pen back to him, watching as he signed in turn. "Agreed," he said quietly, his voice deep. "This is how it will be, for as long as it takes." The room fell silent once more, the crackling of the fire filling the void. But Jessica couldn't ignore the feeling growing inside her. Something about Sebastian's gaze, something about the weight of their agreement, told her that their story was far from simple. And as she stood there in that Duke's library, an overwhelming thought filled her mind. This wasn't just about pretending anymore. The days that followed the agreement were a blur of constant motion, as Jessica was swept into a world she no longer recognized, one that demanded a level of sophistication and decorum she had long since forgotten. She had no choice but to adapt. Lady Cordelia, Sebastian's sharp-tongued aunt, arrived soon after their agreement was signed, and with her came a whirlwind of transformation. Jessica's life was no longer her own. It was now governed by the rules of society, the expectations of the ton, and the rigid structure of aristocratic life. The townhouse, with its vast rooms and towering ceilings, felt cold and impersonal, its luxury only reminding Jessica of how far she had fallen. But Sebastian, ever the distant figure, remained elusive, his presence always a silent shadow in the background, watching her with those piercing eyes, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of indifference. He had made it clear from the outset, no feelings, no attachments. This was a business deal and nothing more. Yet as the days wore on, Jessica began to see cracks in the facade he had carefully built. The first step in her transformation was her wardrobe. Lady Cordelia insisted on the finest gowns, dresses designed to not only fit her new role as Sebastian's fiancée, but to make her indistinguishable from the other women of society. Jessica, a woman once accustomed to simplicity, now found herself in gowns made of silks, velvets, and intricate lace, each one more extravagant than the last. She felt awkward in them, out of place in such luxurious fabrics, but there was no room for hesitation. She had no choice but to wear them. Each day, she spent hours being dressed and taught the mannerisms expected of someone in her position, how to walk, how to speak, how to hold herself with the poise of a lady. She was instructed in the fine art of conversation, learning to navigate the complexities of small talk and superficial pleasantries with ease. It was exhausting, this performance, but she understood why it was necessary. For her family's sake, for her own future, she would have to play the part, and play it well. Sebastian's presence remained largely absent in these early days. He was always busy, wrapped up in his duties as the Duke of Ashford, overseeing the day-to-day affairs of the estate, dealing with the trustees, and managing the complex web of rumors that surrounded him. His reputation, damaged by years of scandal, was something he worked tirelessly to protect, even as he remained emotionally distant. He rarely offered advice or guidance in the transformation that Jessica was undergoing. His role was clear. He had promised to help clear her family's debts, and he intended to keep his word, but the rest of their arrangement, the pretending, the charade, was up to her. And so she did. She allowed herself to be shaped by the expectations of society, losing a little more of her former self with each passing day. But even as she conformed to the image of the perfect fiancé, something inside her began to change. She was no longer the desperate woman who had knocked on Sebastian's door, soaked from the rain, hoping for a lifeline. She was becoming something else. Someone who could pass as a lady, someone who could play the role, even if it felt like she was losing herself in the process. As the days passed, Jessica began to sense that Sebastian was watching her more closely. It wasn't obvious at first, just a fleeting glance, a moment when their eyes met across a room, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, observing her, gauging her performance. She had come to understand him, to realize that his distance was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting himself from the emotional vulnerability that had caused him so much pain in the past. His sister's death, the tragedy that haunted him, was something he refused to confront, something he buried deep inside. He couldn't afford to let anyone in, not even her. But despite his reluctance, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when she saw something else in him, a tenderness, a compassion that he had buried under years of bitterness. It was in the way he spoke to her when no one was around, when his guard slipped just enough to reveal the man beneath the mask. He had a soft side, one that he didn't show to anyone, least of all the people who relied on his image as the notorious, unattached Duke. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling etiquette lesson, Jessica found herself in the library, her head aching from the endless rounds of instruction. She had just barely managed to master the waltz, though it felt more like an elaborate performance than a dance, her every movement calculated, every step a careful measure of grace and poise. She sat down at one of the large tables, hoping for a moment of peace, when the door opened and Sebastian entered, his gaze falling on her with a look of curiosity. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice calm but warm. "You look exhausted." She looked up at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I am," she admitted, rubbing her temples. "It's a lot to learn in such a short time." He walked toward her, his expression softening as he sat down across from her. For a moment, there was a strange, comfortable silence between them. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said quietly, his voice low, almost vulnerable. "You could walk away from all of this. You could find another way to solve your family's problems." She shook her head, her fingers gripping the edges of the table. "I don't have another choice, Sebastian," she said, her voice firm. "This is my only chance. For my family. For my future." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it felt like they were both trapped in the same suffocating reality. Sebastian's gaze dropped at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of a book absently. "I understand," he said finally, "but I don't want you to lose yourself in this role. You're more than just this." He gestured to the elegant gown she wore, the polished mannerisms she had been taught to perfect. "I don't want you to become someone you're not." His words, though spoken softly, hit her hard, and for a moment, she felt something shift within her. It was the first time he had acknowledged the cost of their arrangement, the first time he had recognized the toll it was taking on her. His words, though meant as a reassurance, only made her feel more acutely the weight of the life she was being forced to live. She smiled weakly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's too late for that," she said quietly. "I'm already losing myself." There was a brief flicker of emotion in his eyes, but he said nothing more. Instead, he rose from the table and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the floor. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when it's over, we'll both be free." The door closed behind him, leaving Jessica alone in the silence of the library, her heart heavy with the weight of the life she had chosen. The next few days passed in a blur of constant social events and forced smiles. Jessica's life was no longer her own. She had become a puppet, controlled by the strings of society's expectations and the contract she had signed with Sebastian. But despite the constraints of their agreement, something was changing inside her. She was beginning to see Sebastian for who he truly was, a man who had been hurt, who had been scarred by his past, and who was now trying to protect himself by keeping everyone at arm's length. The walls between them were high. But for the first time, she felt the faintest crack, a glimpse of the man who had once been vulnerable, once been in love, before he buried his heart away to protect it. But Jessica knew, deep down, that it would take more than a few kind words to break through the barriers he had built. It would take time. And time was something they didn't have. As Christmas approached, so did the looming house party at Thornfield Manor. It was to be the grand performance, the ultimate test of their arrangement. For a week, they would be under the scrutiny of the very people who could either accept or destroy them. It was a moment of truth, and neither of them were prepared for what was about to unfold. The week leading up to Christmas Eve was filled with an almost palpable tension as Jessica and Sebastian traveled to Thornfield Manor, the Duke's grand estate in the countryside, for the much-anticipated Christmas house party. The sprawling estate, a mixture of stone and ivy, was blanketed in snow, making it feel like somehow a fairy tale, but there was no magic in the air. Not for Jessica, who found herself surrounded by the very people who had once shunned her. Her former friends now judged her every move, as well as the cold and calculating trustees of Sebastian's fortune. It was in this gilded cage that she and Sebastian would have to navigate their increasingly complicated arrangement. The house was alive with activity, guests arriving in droves, each person more important than the last, their carefully curated expressions hiding their judgments of those around them. As was expected, Jessica and Sebastian were given separate rooms in the wing of the manor, though the proximity between them felt suffocating. Jessica could feel the weight of every whisper, every glance, as if they were both wearing the words "fake engagement" branded on their foreheads. The first few days were a blur of polite smiles and careful interactions, as they participated in the carefully orchestrated Christmas activities meant to build their public image. The festivities seemed endless, caroling in the crisp winter air, decorating the grand tree in the entryway, and attending lavish dinners where Jessica was expected to play the part of Sebastian's fiancée with the utmost grace. Each evening, they would retire to their separate rooms, the tension between them thick in the air. Yet, despite the facade they maintained, something shifted in the stillness of the nights. One evening, both unable to sleep, Jessica found herself walking through the grand corridors of Thornfield Manor, her mind racing with thoughts of what this arrangement had become. She was no longer just pretending to be in love with Sebastian. Somewhere along the way, she had begun to wish it were real. She had begun to care. And she could feel in the way he looked at her, no longer simply the detached duke with a mission, but someone who was beginning to care, too. When she entered the hallway, she found Sebastian standing near the conservatory, looking out at the falling snow with an expression she had never seen before, one of deep sadness. He turned as he heard her approach, his eyes dark with something he hadn't yet shared. Without a word, they walked together to the conservatory, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the cold outside. The snowflakes fell in perfect silence around them, as if the world had stopped to listen to their unspoken words. It was there that Sebastian opened up in a way that surprised her. "I was supposed to watch her," he said softly, his voice thick with regret. "My sister, she drowned in the lake here during a Christmas party. I was 19. I got distracted by a girl, and I failed her. And now He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. Jessica could feel the weight of his words settling heavily between them, like an invisible anchor. She had always known that Sebastian was burdened by something darker than the rumors of his scandals, but hearing out loud made it all too real. Her heart ached for him. He wasn't just a carefree, infamous duke. He was a man who had lost something irreplaceable. "You don't deserve this," he whispered, staring out into the snow. "I don't deserve happiness, especially not at Christmas." Jessica's heart went out to him, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. But then, in a soft voice, she shared her own guilt. "I didn't break my engagement with Lord Ashworth because he was cruel. I broke it because I realized that I would rather have nothing than a life without love. My mother died believing I would marry well and secure our future. But in the end, I lost everything." Her voice broke slightly as the weight of her own story settled on her chest. They stood in silence, connected by the rawness of their shared pain, but the moment was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Sebastian quickly composed himself, his protective mask sliding back into place, but not before he squeezed her hand gently. "We're both prisoners of promises we couldn't keep," he said, his voice soft but resigned. Jessica didn't know how to respond to that. The tension between them had shifted. No longer simply a game of pretend, but something deeper, something more dangerous. The next few days brought more complications. Lord Ashworth, still resentful of Jessica's rejection, made his presence known at every opportunity, watching her closely with an air of superiority. He cornered Jessica one afternoon in the library, his eyes narrowing as he saw through the facade. "This is a farce," he sneered. "He's only protecting you because he thinks you're useful to him. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Jessica's heart raced as his words echoed in her ears, the fear of exposure rising in her chest. But before she could respond, Sebastian entered the room with controlled fury in his eyes. He didn't hesitate. "Touch her again and I'll destroy you," he said coldly, his voice laced with a level of danger that made Lord Ashworth take a step back. The sheer possessiveness in his words took Jessica by surprise. She had always thought of their agreement as a simple arrangement, but in that moment, she realized it was something much more complicated. Sebastian was protecting her. He wasn't just playing a role. He was angry. Angry enough to threaten Lord Ashworth in front of everyone. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just pretend anymore. As the night of the Christmas ball drew closer, Jessica became more and more aware of how much her feelings for Sebastian were changing. But it wasn't just the emotional connection that had shifted. A note was slipped under her door one night, an anonymous warning. "I know your secret. The engagement is a lie. You have until Christmas Eve to leave, or I'll tell everyone." Panic gripped her as she read the note. Someone knew the truth. Someone who wasn't afraid to ruin everything. She had no idea who could be behind it. Ashworth, one of the jealous debutantes, or even Lady Cordelia. Trusting no one, Jessica and Sebastian had to navigate the final days of their ruse carefully, performing their roles flawlessly to keep suspicion at bay. Yet, the more they acted as though they were in love, the more they realized they were falling for each other, and neither of them knew how to handle it. The countdown to Christmas Eve had begun, and with it, the stakes had never been higher. Would they be able to maintain their charade until the ball? And if the truth came out, would they survive the consequences? The uncertainty gnawed at Jessica, but one thing was clear. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous pretending became. The days leading up to the Christmas Eve ball had become a tangled web of nerves, secrets, and unspoken emotions, and Jessica couldn't help but feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. The anonymous note that had been slipped under her door gnawed at her with every passing hour, each minute spent wondering who had sent it and why. Was it Lord Ashworth, still harboring resentment for her rejection? Or was it someone closer to Sebastian, someone who saw through their charade and wanted to expose the truth before it was too late? As the hours passed, Jessica's mind spun with possibilities, none of them pleasant. She found herself questioning every glance, every word, and every encounter. Trust became an elusive concept, slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on to it. In the midst of it all, Sebastian remained as elusive as ever, his distance almost tangible, though his actions, protecting her from Ashworth, standing by her side at every event, told a different story. She was beginning to realize that there was far more to their arrangement than either of them had acknowledged. For every moment of tenderness, when he caught her eye, when he whispered words of reassurance during their waltzes, when he seemed to share a rare, vulnerable side of himself, there was an equal amount of distance. He was shutting something out, keeping his true self hidden behind walls he had carefully built over the years, and Jessica was no closer breaking through than she had been when she first stepped into his life. As the tension between them grew, so did their need to keep up the facade. Their appearances at various events became more and more frequent, each one requiring them to act the part of the perfect couple. The guests at Thornfield Manor were a mix of old acquaintances, wealthy socialites, and relatives, none of whom were as easily fooled as they might have hoped. Lady Cordelia, ever sharp and perceptive, was beginning to ask questions Jessica couldn't answer. Her piercing eyes seemed to notice every detail, every subtle gesture that hinted at something beneath the surface. Jessica felt like she was being watched at all times, her every move scrutinized by Lady Cordelia's hawk-like gaze. There was no escaping it. Every glance exchanged with Sebastian, every accidental touch, every soft word, was being catalogued, analyzed, and eventually discussed behind closed doors. As if to add to the mounting pressure, the note hung over Jessica's head like a sword, constantly threatening to unravel everything. She couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, that the truth would come crashing down sooner or later, but she had no idea who to trust. She certainly couldn't trust Lord Ashworth, who was more than happy to keep the charade alive while also making veiled threats at every opportunity. And she wasn't entirely sure about Lady Cordelia, despite the fact that the woman had always been kind to her in her own, sharp-tongued way. The only person she could truly rely on was Sebastian, and even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from her. One afternoon, Jessica found herself once again in the library, trying to distract herself from the anxiety building in her chest. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold, biting wind outside. She absently ran her fingers over the pages of a book she wasn't really reading, her mind racing as she thought about the past few weeks. The holiday season had always been a time of family for her, before everything had fallen apart, before her life had been shattered by betrayal and scandal. Now, all she had was this arrangement with Sebastian, an arrangement that seemed to be growing increasingly complicated by the day. The sound of footsteps behind her pulled her out of her thoughts, and she turned to find Sebastian standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, a silent understanding passing between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low and soft. "We need to talk," he said, his tone far more serious than she was accustomed to. Jessica felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. "About what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "The note," he replied. "I know it's been bothering you, and I think it's time we figure out who's behind it." His words, though reassuring, sent a wave of dread crashing over her. Who would send such a note? And what would they do if the truth was exposed? She had no answers, but she couldn't help but feel that they were running out of time. "Have you told anyone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "No, but we need to be careful. Someone wants to ruin this, and we don't know who. We need to stick together if we're going to survive this." Jessica nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how much longer they could keep up the charade. She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with every passing day. As they sat down together, their conversation shifted to other matters. The mounting pressure from the trustees, the ball that was drawing nearer, and the ever-present expectation that they would perform as the perfect couple. Yet, as they spoke, the distance between them seemed to grow. Each word, each glance, seemed to push them further apart, as if they were both afraid to confront the truth. And then, just as the conversation began to settle into uncomfortable silence, another note arrived, slipped under the door without so much as a sound. Jessica's heart raced as she picked it up, reading the short, chilling message. 2 days until the ball. Make your choice. Her blood ran cold as she read the words over and over again. What choice? What choice did she have left? Her mind raced, wondering who was behind this, and what they wanted from her. Was it Ashworth? Was it Lady Cordelia? Or was it someone who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to expose the truth? As the days ticked by, Jessica found herself more and more trapped by the weight of the secret they were both keeping. The house party continued in full swing, each day marked by forced smiles, rehearsed gestures, and the growing tension between her and Sebastian. At night, when they were alone in their rooms, the silence between them was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside. And yet, despite the growing unease, there were moments, brief flashes of connection, that reminded her why she had agreed to this arrangement in the first place. It wasn't just about the money, the debts, or the reputation. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had expected. And it was in those fleeting moments, when their gazes locked, when his hand brushed hers, when his voice softened with tenderness, that Jessica realized she was in over her head. She had never imagined that pretending to be in love with Sebastian would lead her here, to a place where the line between pretense and reality was so dangerously thin. The moment she feared was approaching fast, and with it came the inevitable question. Could they keep pretending, or would the truth come crashing down and destroy everything they had built? Time was running out. The stakes were higher than ever. And Jessica couldn't help but wonder if, after everything, she would be able to survive the consequences of what they had started. The night of the Christmas Eve ball arrived with an overwhelming mixture of excitement and dread. Thornfield Manor had been transformed into something out of a dream. Candles flickered throughout the grand ballroom, casting soft, golden light on a towering Christmas tree that stood proudly in the center, its branches weighed down with glittering ornaments and rich velvet ribbons. Snow continued to fall gently outside, creating a scene so picturesque it seemed unreal, as though the world outside had stopped moving. Jessica couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and dread as she stood in front of the full-length mirror in her room, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the dark blue velvet gown that hugged her body perfectly, the low neckline subtly revealing the elegant curve of her neck. Her hair had been carefully arranged in intricate curls that cascaded down her back, and her makeup was flawless. But despite all of it, she felt strangely empty inside. The grand occasion that was supposed to mark the peak of their performance, their final act in the charade, was now weighing heavily on her heart. As she looked at herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself in the role she had been playing for weeks. The woman in the mirror wasn't the real Jessica Hartley. She wasn't the girl who had once dreamed of a life filled with love, adventure, and joy. No, she was a fiancée of Sebastian Thornfield, a man she was beginning to care for far more than she was ready to admit. And what did that mean? What would it mean when the clock struck midnight and the ball came to an end? The thought gnawed at her as she stood before the mirror, trying to steady her breath. The door to her room opened, and Sebastian stepped inside, looking every bit the part of the Duke he was supposed to be. His black tuxedo was impeccably tailored, and his silver cufflinks gleamed in the candlelight, but it was the look in his eyes that caught her attention. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and something shifted. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it deep in her chest. "You look stunning," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, as if he, too, was feeling the weight of the evening. Jessica offered a shaky smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You look perfect." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. Perfect wasn't the right word. He didn't look perfect. He looked guarded, distant, like a man who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was a man with secrets, and every time she tried to get closer, those secrets seemed to push her further away. "Are you ready?" he asked, though his eyes still lingered on her with a mixture of admiration and something else she couldn't place. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, forcing a smile. She was far from ready. The anxiety that had been building inside her for days was now at a boiling point, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. They walked together to the ballroom, where the guests had already begun to gather. The murmur of polite conversation filled the air as the first guests entered the grand room, their laughter and voices blending with the sound of the orchestra playing softly in the background. The ballroom was as grand as it had always been, but it felt different now. It felt like a stage, an arena where Sebastian and Jessica were about to perform their final act. As they entered, the room fell silent for a moment, the eyes of every guest turning toward them. Jessica felt the heat of so many gazes on her, but she kept her head held high, determined to play her part. Sebastian's hand gently rested on her lower back as they walked toward the center of the ballroom, where they were expected to dance their first waltz. The guests parted to make way for them, and in that moment, Jessica felt all eyes on her. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy cloak. They reached the center of the room, and the music shifted, signaling the start of their dance. Sebastian's hand slid to her waist, and she placed her hand gently on his shoulder as they began to move. At first, the dance was easy, practiced, rehearsed. They had danced together countless times before, but tonight there was something different in the air. Their movements were fluid, their steps in perfect time with the music, but there was an underlying tension between them now, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the pressure of performing. It was something deeper, something unspoken. It was in the way Sebastian's hand rested on her waist, firm but gentle, guiding her with a sense of possessiveness that sent a shiver down her spine. As they danced, Jessica couldn't help but feel the pull of their connection, the way their bodies moved in perfect harmony, despite the walls they had both built between them. She could feel his breath against her cheek, and when their eyes met, It was as if the world around them disappeared. In that moment, there was no crowd, no ball, no performance, just the two of them caught in the tension of their unspoken emotions. It didn't last long. The moment was fleeting, and the reality of the situation came rushing back. The song ended, and the applause of the guests brought them back to the present. They smiled, nodded, and pretended everything was fine, but the truth was, Jessica felt as though something had shifted irrevocably between them. As the night wore on, the tension continued to build. Sebastian was as distant as ever, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. Something important, something that had to do with his past, his guilt over his sister's death, and the burden he carried every day. But she couldn't ask him about it. She couldn't press him for answers, not when their entire arrangement was based on one simple rule: no real feelings. They were supposed to be pretending, after all. But when Lord Ashworth appeared, his smug face betraying no hint of the malicious intent behind his smile, Jessica's stomach dropped. He walked toward them with his new mistress, a beautiful woman draped in gold and diamonds, and his eyes immediately locked onto hers with that familiar, disdainful gaze. "It's good to see you again, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "And to see you so, well." His eyes flicked toward Sebastian, and for a moment, Jessica saw the flicker of something dangerous in Sebastian's expression. "Lord Ashworth," Sebastian said smoothly, his voice colder than the winter air outside. "How nice to see you again." His words were calm, but there was an edge to his tone that made Jessica's heart skip a beat. It was the first time she had seen Sebastian truly on edge, his calm mask slipping just slightly as he faced his old rival. "I trust your new engagement is going well?" Ashworth asked, his voice mocking. "Of course. We're all so very pleased for you, aren't we, Sebastian?" The comment stung, and Jessica felt the unease creeping up her spine as Ashworth's words sank in. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for some kind of reaction. But Sebastian didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "If you're here to ruin my night, Lord Ashworth, I suggest you leave." There was no mistaking the threat in his voice. Jessica watched as Ashworth's smirk faltered for just a second, but then he regained his composure, offering them both a mocking bow before turning away. It was a small victory, but it was one that left Jessica shaken. The intensity in Sebastian's voice, the way he defended her, had caught her completely off guard, but it also made her realize something she hadn't fully understood before. Sebastian wasn't just pretending, and neither was she. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the ballroom became more charged, the music growing louder, more festive, more desperate. But for Jessica, it felt like everything was moving in slow motion. The final moment of the night was approaching, and as much as she tried to tell herself it was all performance, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Sebastian and Jessica had both fallen for each other, and there was no way out. But before she could dwell on it, the unthinkable happened. Someone had stolen their contract. Someone had exposed the truth. The trustee Blackwood had the paper in hand, and as the crowd gathered, he read it aloud. "A business arrangement," he said, his voice cold. No genuine affection. The room was silent, and Jessica's heart sank. The world had just crumbled around her. The shock of the revelation hit Jessica like a blow to the chest, her breath catching in her throat as the crowd around her gasped, eyes wide with disbelief. The contract, the one they had both agreed to, the one that had kept them bound by the rules of their arrangement, had been stolen from Sebastian's study. It had been exposed to the very people they had tried to deceive, and now, standing in the heart of the ballroom, surrounded by harsh whispers and judgmental stares, Jessica felt the walls closing in on her. The reality of their situation hit her hard. This wasn't just a matter of keeping up appearances anymore. It was a matter of survival, and everything they had built was crumbling in an instant. The trustee Blackwood's voice echoed in the room as he read aloud the terms of their agreement, the words cutting through the air like a blade. A business arrangement. No genuine affection. The accusation stung, and Jessica felt her cheeks flush with shame, though she quickly masked the emotion with a forced smile. She was caught in a lie that had seemed harmless when they first began, but now, with everyone watching, it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She glanced at Sebastian, hoping for some sign that he would step forward and defend them both. But instead, he stood there, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room was deafening, and for a moment, it felt as though the whole world had frozen around her. But then, to her surprise, Sebastian did speak. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and his words were clear, cutting through the tension like a lifeline. "Every word is true," he said, his gaze never leaving Blackwood's. "We made an agreement. It was business." The room seemed to hold its breath, and Jessica felt her heart sink further, her chest tightening with fear. Was this it? Was he about to deny everything? But then, without warning, Sebastian's voice grew stronger, more defiant. "But what that paper doesn't say," he continued, his eyes flashing with something fierce, "is that I fell in love with her anyway." The words hit Jessica like a thunderclap, and for a moment, she could only stare at him, her mind racing to process what he'd just said. Had he really just said that? In front of everyone? The gasp that rippled through the crowd was deafening, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world had paused. Jessica's heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to comprehend the weight of his confession. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't what they had agreed to. But there was no mistaking the sincerity in his eyes, the raw emotion in his voice. Sebastian had just admitted to something he hadn't been willing to say before, something that made everything, feel so much more real than it ever had before. She wanted to say something, to react, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him and say that she felt the same, that she was in love with him too, but the moment was too overwhelming. The room had gone silent again, all eyes on them, waiting for her response. And in that moment, Jessica realized that there was no turning back. The truth had been exposed, and now she had to face it head-on. She stepped forward, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. She had nothing left to hide. She had to tell the truth. "He's protecting me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "The truth is, I proposed this arrangement. I used him." She felt the weight of her confession settle on her, but it was nothing compared to the release that came with saying it out loud. "I came to him with nothing, and he gave me everything, including a reason to believe I wasn't broken." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Jessica's heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't look away from Sebastian. She couldn't. She had to make him understand, had to make everyone understand, that this wasn't just about a business arrangement. It wasn't just about pretending. It was about something deeper. It was about love, real love, that neither of them had been willing to admit until that moment. The silence in the room stretched on, the guests waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. But then, to Jessica's surprise, it was Sebastian who stepped forward, his gaze unwavering as he addressed the trustees. "Take the fortune," he said, his voice cold and defiant. "I don't care, but you will not speak ill of her." The room seemed to hold its breath again, the shock of his words reverberating through the space. Sebastian's declaration was a gamble, but Jessica could see the raw determination in his eyes, the unspoken promise that he would do whatever it took to protect her. And in that moment, Jessica realized that he was no longer the man she had agreed to pretend with. He was the man she was in love with, the man who had just risked everything for her. As the trustee Blackwood stood there, seemingly weighing the situation, there was a long, uncomfortable pause. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke, his voice softer than it had been before. "Your fathers were required evidence of reformed character, Your Grace," Blackwood said, his tone far more thoughtful than before. "I'd say loving someone more than money is rather reformed." The words, though simple, carried the weight of approval. Jessica blinked, surprised by the shift in the mood. The trustees, it seemed, were no longer concerned with the terms of their agreement. They were concerned with something far more important, Sebastian's priorities. And in that moment, The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The trustees, the ones who had been so skeptical of Sebastian's character, had been testing him all along. They had wanted to see if he would choose love over money, and by admitting the truth, by standing up for her, he had passed their test. The tension in the room finally began to ease, the harsh stares from the guests softening. Jessica, still reeling from the whirlwind of emotions, could hardly believe what had just happened. Sebastian had just risked everything, his fortune, his future, his reputation, all for her. The realization hit her hard, and she felt a lump form in her throat. But before she could fully process the enormity of the moment, the night took another unexpected turn. Jessica, overwhelmed by the intensity of it all, turned to leave the ballroom, her heart racing in her chest. She needed to escape, to gather her thoughts, to breathe. She rushed out into the snow-covered garden, the cold air biting at her skin, but she didn't care. All she could think about was Sebastian, about what he had just done for her, about what it meant for their future. But before she could go far, she heard the crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Sebastian, his face etched with concern, his eyes searching hers. "Jessica," he said softly, his voice urgent. "The rule was no real feelings," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Then we've both broken it," he replied, his voice low and filled with emotion. For the first time, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the cracks in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. And in that moment, she realized that there was no going back. Their feelings for each other were real. There was no pretending anymore. Without a word, he stepped forward, his hand reaching out to gently grasp hers. The touch, warm and comforting, sent a wave of relief through her. She had no more secrets, no more lies, and neither did he. Together, they had broken all the rules, and for the first time it felt right. 6 weeks had passed since that fateful Christmas Eve, and in that time, everything had changed. The snow that had once blanketed Thornfield Manor now lay in patches across the ground, a reminder of the winter that had brought them together, and also the transformation that had taken place in both their lives. The whirlwind that had started as a simple arrangement, a business contract, had evolved into something deep, something real. Jessica couldn't quite explain when the shift had occurred. Was it the moment Sebastian had stood before the trustees and admitted his feelings? Or was it when she confessed her own, so terrified of the truth yet so relieved to finally speak it out loud? Either way, here they were, standing in the quiet chapel of Thornfield Manor, preparing for a wedding that neither of them had expected. The small, intimate ceremony was everything they had both secretly wanted but had never believed possible. The room was filled with a quiet hum of anticipation, the guests speaking in hushed tones as they took their places. There were no extravagant decorations, no over-the-top displays of wealth. Instead, the ceremony was simple, elegant, and personal. The only adornments in the room were the winter roses that Jessica had chosen for her bouquet, their white petals symbolizing the new beginning they were about to embark upon. As Jessica stood at the altar, her hands clasped tightly together, she couldn't help but think of how far they had come. The woman she had once been, the desperate, broken girl who walked into Sebastian's library all those weeks ago, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had fought for her future, for her family, and for the love she never thought she would find. She glanced over at Sebastian, who stood beside her, his face more relaxed than it had been in days, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't the same guarded look he had worn in the beginning, when he had been determined to keep his distance. No, this was something softer, something more genuine. The man who stood before her now wasn't just the Duke of Ashford. He was a man who had taken risks, who had allowed himself to feel, and who had chosen to love her. And in that moment, Jessica knew, deep in her heart, that she had made the right choice. She had chosen him, just as he had chosen her. The ceremony itself was a blur, a mixture of vows spoken with sincerity and the soft rustle of the guests shifting in their seats. Sebastian's vows were simple yet profound, promising to love her, honor her and never lie again. And when Jessica spoke her own vows, they came from the depths of her soul. She promised to remind him every day that he deserved happiness, that he was worthy of love despite the mistakes he had made in the past. The words came easily, as though they had been waiting inside her for so long. She had never felt more sure of anything in her life. When the vows were exchanged and the small, intimate ceremony came to an end, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. Jessica and Sebastian were married. They were no longer playing a part. They were no longer pretending. They were real, and their love was real. The night that followed was everything Jessica had dreamed of but never thought possible. It wasn't a night of grand gestures or fireworks, but something far more intimate. It was tender, emotional, and full of trust, an intimacy born from the battles they had fought together, from the pain they had shared, and from the love that had grown between them. It wasn't about duty or obligation. It was about the truth they had finally embraced. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of their shared chamber, they lay together, talking about their future. The world outside had changed, and so had they. Sebastian spoke of his plans to finally start the housing project he had dreamed of for so long, a project that would allow families to live in affordable homes, away from the societal expectations of wealth and power. Jessica listened, her heart swelling with pride as she realized how far he had come. He wasn't just a Duke of Ashford. He was a man who wanted to make a real difference in the world. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he spoke with conviction about his future. And as they spoke, Jessica realized that she, too, had dreams of her own. She wanted to open a foundation for women who, like her, had nowhere else to go. She wanted to create a safe place where women could rebuild their lives, where they could find hope and strength in each other. Like I was, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Like we were, Sebastian corrected, his hand gently squeezing hers. It was a small moment, but it meant everything to her. They weren't just building their own future. They were building something together. As the weeks passed, Jessica and Sebastian's lives began to take shape. They had been through so much, both individually and together, but now they had the freedom to build a life based on love, trust, and mutual respect. They had paid off the debts that had once threatened to tear her family apart, and her father, now sober and healthier, had reconciled with her. The shadow of the past was slowly fading, and with it came the promise of a brighter future. But even as they moved forward, there were moments when they had to confront the pain of the past. One day, Sebastian visited his sister's grave, finally able to say goodbye to the woman he had failed. He stood there in silence for a long time, the weight of his guilt still heavy in his heart. But Jessica was there with him, holding his hand as he whispered a prayer, and when he planted forget-me-nots around the headstone, Jessica knew that he was finally letting go of the past. The healing had begun. It wasn't just about the mistakes they had made. It was about the future they could create together. And that future was starting to take shape. As spring arrived, so did the first signs of the changes they had dreamed of. Sebastian's housing project was underway, the first homes being built on the land he had purchased months before. Jessica's foundation was beginning to take shape as well, her vision slowly becoming a reality. She had already begun to reach out to women in need, offering them a place to stay, a chance to rebuild their lives. The future they had once thought impossible was now within their reach. One afternoon, they found themselves back in the library of Thornfield Manor, the place where it all began. The blood-red contract, the one they had signed all those weeks ago, still sat in Sebastian's desk drawer, a silent reminder of their past. But as they looked at it now, it felt like a relic, something that no longer had any power over them. Together, they took the contract, walked to the fireplace, and burned it. The flames consumed the paper, the heat licking at their fingers as they watched it disintegrate into ash. It was symbolic, a final gesture of letting go. No more rules, Jessica said, her voice full of emotion. Except one, Sebastian countered, his eyes locking onto hers with a look of tenderness that made her heart skip a beat. Love each other. Every day. No matter what. And in that moment, Jessica knew that this was the life they were going to build together, a life free from the constraints of the past, free from the lies and the rules they had once lived by, a life full of love, honesty, and new beginnings. The future was theirs, and they were ready to embrace it, hand in hand, with no more secrets between them. As they stood together in the warmth of the firelight, watching the last of the contract burn, they knew that they had everything they needed. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. A year had passed since that fateful Christmas Eve when everything had changed. The world outside Thornfield Manor was once again covered in snow, but this time it felt different. There was a sense of warmth that had never been present before, a sense of home that Jessica could hardly believe was real. The grand estate, which had once been a place of secrets and unspoken tension, now felt like a place of love and hope. Inside, the house was filled with the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of conversation. But this time, it wasn't just the high society guests and the trustees who filled the rooms. No, this time, Thornfield Manor was alive with the presence of those they had helped, those they had opened their doors to, the orphans from Jessica's foundation, the workers from Sebastian's housing project, and the people who had once been strangers to them all sat together at the long dining table, sharing in the joy of the holiday season. It was a celebration unlike any other, a celebration of new beginnings, of hope, and of the family they had built together. In the corner of the room, Jessica sat by the fire, a soft smile on her lips as she cradled the rounded curve of her belly. She was 7 months pregnant, the baby kicking gently against her skin, and the thought of becoming a mother filled her with both excitement and awe. She had never imagined that her life would turn out like this. A year ago, she had been lost, broken, desperate, and afraid. But now, she was full of life, full of love, and full of hope for the future. Her eyes shifted to Sebastian, who was standing near the window, his gaze distant but soft as he watched the snow fall outside. His broad shoulders, once so stiff with responsibility, now seemed relaxed, his expression filled with contentment and peace. He had changed, too. The man who had once been burdened by guilt, by the weight of his past, was now a man who was ready to embrace the future. He had finally let go of the ghosts that had haunted him for so long, his sister, the guilt, the fear of failure, and had opened his heart to the possibility of happiness. And in doing so, he had given Jessica the most beautiful gift of all, a love that was real, a love that had no strings attached, no conditions, and no pretenses. As she watched him, her heart swelled with affection, her love for him deeper than she had ever thought possible. He was no longer just a man she had entered into a fake engagement with. He was her husband, the father of their child, and her partner in everything. He kicked, Jessica whispered softly, her hand resting on her belly as she glanced up at Sebastian. He turned to her, his eyes lighting up with joy at the mention of their unborn child. "She!" he said with a playful smile, his hand gently brushing against her growing stomach. "You're sure it's a girl?" he teased, his voice filled with the warmth of their shared intimacy. Jessica laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm sure. I've been feeling it. Sebastian, it's a girl." He crouched down beside her, placing his hand over hers, feeling the gentle movements of the baby inside her. It was a moment of quiet, simple happiness, a moment that spoke volumes about the life they had built together. As they sat there, their hands entwined, Jessica thought back to that night a year ago when she had stumbled into Sebastian's library, drenched from the rain, desperate for a way out. She had never imagined that it would lead her here, to this place, with this man, with this life. She had never imagined that pretending could lead to something so real. And yet, here she was, in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the people they had helped, the people who had become part of their new family. Her eyes drifted to the door as it opened, and she smiled as a young woman stepped inside. The woman, barely older than a girl, looked around with wide eyes, taking the warmth of the room, the laughter, the love. Jessica recognized her immediately. She was one of the women from her foundation, a girl who had come to them with nothing but the clothes on her back, someone who had been lost and alone in the world. But now, she was here, safe, and part of the family they had created. Jessica stood and walked over to her, her smile gentle but filled with understanding. "Come in," she said warmly, wrapping an arm around the young woman's shoulders. "You're part of this, too." The girl's eyes filled with tears, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Jessica's heart swelled as she looked at her, realizing that this was what it was all about. This was why she had fought for her family, why she had started the foundation in the first place. To give people like this young woman a chance to rebuild their lives, just as she had been given a chance. She turned to look at Sebastian, who was now standing beside them, his hand resting gently on her back. His eyes were filled with pride as he looked at the young woman, and Jessica knew, without a doubt, that this was a life they had always dreamed of, a life of purpose, a life of giving, a life built on love. "We're building something together," she said softly to Sebastian, her voice filled with emotion. "We're making a difference." He nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder as he kissed the top of her head. "We are," he replied, "and we're just getting started." As the evening wore on, the guests mingled, enjoying the food, the music, and the warmth of the celebration. It wasn't just a Christmas party. It was a celebration of everything they had built, everything they had overcome. It was a celebration of the future they were going to build together. Jessica and Sebastian's journey had been filled with hardship, with moments of doubt, but in the end, it had led them to something far greater than they had ever expected. They had found love, and in doing so, they had found their true purpose. As the night drew to a close, Jessica stood by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds of Thornfield Manor, her hand resting gently on her belly. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, and full of promise. She could see the future unfolding before her, the future she had once thought was beyond her reach, a future filled with love, with family, and with the hope of new beginnings. Sebastian joined her, his hand resting on her waist as they stood together, watching the snow fall in the stillness of the night. "Merry Christmas, Your Grace," Jessica whispered, a smile tugging at her lips as she leaned against him. He kissed her forehead, his voice soft and full of love. "Merry Christmas, my love," he replied, his arms wrapping around her as they stood together, united in the quiet beauty of the moment. The church bells rang across the valley, their sound carrying to the cold winter air, and for the first time in Jessica's life, she felt truly at peace. She had found everything she had been searching for, the love she had always dreamed of, the family she had longed for, and the future she had once thought was impossible. As she stood in the arms of the man she loved, with the child they were about to bring into the world, she knew that this was only the beginning. Their story, their love, had come full circle, and there was no turning back. The future was theirs, and together they would face whatever came next, hand in hand. And as the snow continued to fall outside, Jessica whispered a prayer of gratitude, knowing that her life had been forever changed. This was her happily ever after,